Mark McMullen has been appointed as a state economist and the director of the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. This office is responsible for providing objective forecasts of the state's economy, tax revenue, and population, and sending us all a rebate check. Is that true? The kicker. The office's main goal is to advance the objectives of the governor, legislators, state agencies, and the public. Before joining the Office of Economic Analysis, Mark in 2010 was the director of consulting at Moody's Analytics and a researcher with the Congressional Budget Office. So tell you a little bit about Mark there. I got to do a few more things though before we get started. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsor for today's event, Citizens Bank. Ray, would you like to wave your arm? Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And we do have a few of our elected representatives and officials and state senators here today. I'd like to recognize State Senator Mark Meek. He's become a regular here. We really enjoy your attendance and participation in the discussion. And we have Clackamas County Chair Tootie Smith. Clackamas County Commissioner Mark Scholl. And I believe Martha Schrader is still coming. I've got her on my list, but I haven't seen her arrive yet. So we'll wave to her when she comes in. We have County Treasurer Brian Nava. We have Oregon City Commissioner Mike Mitchell. We have Oregon City Commissioner Adam Morrow. And we have a few people who are running for office. Jamie McLeod Skinner, who's running in the 5th District for U.S. Congress.
Commissioner here in the city as well.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Miles Kinney. I work with Adam on the Youth Advisory Commission in Oregon City.
Okay, great. And Amy Nichols, running for the county position. County Commissioner position. Former County Commissioner Sonia Fisher. All right, who have I left out? There's got to be somebody. Oh, okay, help me out here. Oh, okay, Tina, thank you for coming. We appreciate it. And let's give a round of applause to the Abernathy staff for putting together another excellent buffet. One of the highlights of our Business Alliance forums that we have here. I'm going to mention another event twice, right now and then at the end, just so it sinks into you. Next month, the Oregon City Business Alliance will be hosting a new event here at the Abernathy Center called Business of the County. And it's going to feature all 5 of the county commissioners in more of a Q&A type arrangement and format, unlike the State of the County gathering that they'll have on May 9th, where they're doing more of their formal presentations and having a smaller Q&A session. This will almost 100% be Q&A. So we encourage all of you to come. Again, it's not our regularly scheduled date, which is always the 4th Tuesday of every month. This one's going to be on Thursday, April 18th, from 11:30 to 1:30. And we've already started sending out the registration flyers to all the Business Alliance membership, the Chamber for North Clackamas and Oregon City, their membership, CCBA, HBA. So we're really hoping to have a big turnout where we actually knock out that back wall and fill up this whole space. So I'm mentioning it now, but I want to mention it again before we leave, because we really want you all to be here. And just a reminder that for questions, the blue cards on your table, go ahead and fill them out, and Sherry or someone else from the Business Alliance will swing by and pick those up, and we'll read those at the end. The gray cards are for you to kind of rate today's event, what you liked about it. You don't need to tell us what you didn't like, but mostly what you liked about it. And then also what other topics you'd like us to focus in on throughout the rest of this year. Again, we're here to serve you. We're here to bring in experts that have backgrounds and knowledge in areas that are important to you. And with this being an election year, probably even more important that we hear from you. And we do have a little celebration that tolling's been paused. So that's great news, but we're not out of the woods yet. It's still going to be on the legislative agenda for the long session next year. So keep talking to all your elected officials and make sure that they're aware that whatever the legislature comes up with, it's fair and equitable. All right, with that being said, Mark, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you and let you get started in telling us about the economy.
Thank you, Kent. Thank you guys so much for having me. As Kent mentioned, on my office, the Office of Economic Analysis, our prime directive is this quarterly economic and revenue update that we give to the legislature to set the bar for the balanced budget requirements and, of course, our unique kicker law and the like. So, yes, it is true. I am the kicker guy. Usually this is when people in the audience say, oh, yeah, you're the kicker guy. Thanks. Thank you. And I blush and look away. Stuff like that, but nevertheless, so that's the prime directive that we do. We do a lot of other things as well, largely because we have a perception of objectivity. We have a lot of policymakers in the room here, and it's pretty clear that policymakers care more that we be objective than we be competent, which is very useful for us. And so we catch all sorts of other agency level analyses where we don't have necessarily the expertise at the ground level, but we don't have skin in the game. So we do criminal justice forecasts for the youth authority populations, the public defenders now, we just caught that along with the adult population. We do highway cost, Kent mentioned, and of course that right now is pretty contentious as well. We've just caught the new housing needs analysis. To go with that, we do also the criminal justice office of the judicial department. We do marijuana and psilocybin. We do lottery, all these different things that are kind of outside of our portfolio, but where policymakers would like to have some sort of objective look at things. And so a lot of the stuff I'm going to put out to you today comes from that. It's going to bore Senator Meek because he's been on our committees for some time now, and so a lot of this will be repetitive, but I'll just go through a little bit of the overall, what's going on in the U.S., boil that down to Oregon, and then try as much as I can to boil it down regionally. It's tough to get numbers for Oregon City alone, but we'll do a lot of stuff at the county level and at the census, PUMA level and the like, to try to get an idea of some of the hot topics that are going on right now. So from the U.S. perspective, the hot topic is still inflation and the concern about the extent to which monetary policy makers at the Federal Reserves are still have the brakes on, and to what extent, does this risk, sending the economy into recession. And for right now, things are looking kind of better. Insofar as a pretty strong consensus of economic forecasters is thinking that this soft landing kind of scenario might be achievable. And that seems to be the consensus view right now. Of course, whenever you have a big consensus of economic forecasters, you know something's going to go wrong. But nevertheless, so far so good. On the left, you see the West region inflation, and we're down to about 3%, which is still a little bit above the Fed's target, but getting there. And we're also seeing the labor market cool on the right side. I'm sorry if you can't read these. We have the job opening rate in blue and the worker quit rate in orange, which were both very elevated right after the pandemic, when these labor markets overheated and created a lot of this inflationary pressure. And so we're starting to see, which is what the Federal Reserve intends, is to try to slow down cool off that labor market, but without choking it off altogether, which historically has been something very difficult to do. And so it's a big ask, but so far so good. Of course, unfortunately, although this trajectory is very much consistent with a soft landing, it's still also consistent with a hard landing as well. So we're not there yet until we get to the point where monetary policymakers kind of change their position and feel comfortable lowering interest rates. But for now, across Oregon, things are pretty good, in particular this income story. Again, I'm sorry about all these charts. I have way too many of them, so I won't go through all of them. I'll skip a bunch, but I have them here just in case questions refer to some of these. But nevertheless, blue line being income and the orange line being prices, we are seeing real growth in income across the state and in all regions of the state, which has been a pretty equal opportunity expansion relative to the past, where a lot of the regions have been left behind. So far, so good. Particularly if you have a job and own a home. Here you see wages on the left are higher than we would have expected before the pandemic, and we had thousands and thousands of job losses. But we're still on a higher trajectory than the trend we were on then. And now a lot of this has to do with the extra tight labor market. But nevertheless, this has done wonders for household balance sheets in terms of we do see now some of the lower income households are starting to struggle in terms of delinquency rates on credit and the like. But for the most part, the typical household is in a more solid foundation than they were pre-pandemic. On the right, you see that's particularly true if you own a home in Oregon. A massive amount. So the average homeowner in Oregon now has $400,000 worth of equity, which is a tremendous cushion. Now that's average, and so the really big ones obviously skew that up. Where there are a lot of homeowners that don't have much equity, and then a few that have millions, and so those millions, in terms of the averages, are something. But at any rate, things are pretty good, in particular since a lot of them locked in these lower rates. So for the existing mortgage now in Oregon, we're still looking at a sub 4% interest rate in terms of the mortgages that they have. Now, some people argue that's not great because people are kind of trapped in their homes, where there would be more transactions if not for the higher rates now today, because you would take this big penalty if you locked in a very low rate, and now we're going to try to move to a different place. So that does kind of put a damper on some of the transactions. The flip side of this is if you don't have a job or you hadn't bought a home. In particular, our large millennial population cohort that we'll talk about quite a bit going forward, it's starting to be a little bit more difficult to get a job. We're looking at this hiring rates on the left in both Oregon and the US are now down to where they were, in the middle of the last decade as we were coming out of the Great Recession. And on the right, of course, the mortgage rates are higher than they've been in years and years. And so if you are outside of the housing market trying to look in, that's not the best place to be right now. So it's not entirely an equal opportunity expansion, but about as close as we ever get. One place that's been different across this cycle has been the mix in terms of performance of our rural areas, our mid-sized metro areas, and our big metro areas, where just like everywhere else in the US, we're seeing the Portland, our largest metropolitan area, the light blue line at the bottom, lag in terms of jobs. The way to read this chart is we start at 0 at the beginning of the recession. So that's at the peak of jobs. Then we lose thousands of jobs, 14%. The same across whether you're rural, whether you're mid-sized metro, whether you're Portland. It was really, the pandemic was really an equal opportunity recession. It hit everywhere the same. Everywhere had, these front-facing consumer service, retail, trade, education sectors that got hit real hard. And so we saw kind of the same performance. As we've come out, much like elsewhere in the US, the larger the weaker in terms of our bounce back. Now, that said, a lot of time, the question is, so what's wrong with Portland? Well, maybe nothing so much from an economic perspective. Obviously, people have their opinions of what's wrong with Portland, but you see here in terms of jobs at least, about back up to peak, and that's right about in the middle of the pack in terms of jobs relative to the other top 100 metropolitan areas. We're right along the lines of where Seattle is, right in the middle of the pack in terms of jobs. So nothing too crazy in terms of the employment. Now that said, Portland's used to being one of the high flyers. So being in the middle of the pack is actually, not as not as good performance as we're used to, because we're used to being up there with Salt Lake City and Austin and the like, and that's not the case anymore, where we are a little bit behind. But there are a lot of issues, and a lot of it's hidden beneath this level. This is the metropolitan area level. So we're counting Clackamas County, Multnomah County, Washington County, all of it. We're not talking about just downtown. And in downtown, we do see some pretty scary indicators. Today's paper talked about the office vacancy rate. We're also looking at, in terms of house price appreciation, it being very, very weak downtown. And I think that kind of fits with, kind of the impression you get nowadays, when you just go down there and see what's going on. So things aren't terrible, and they're very much like what's going on elsewhere in the U.S., but again, I can't really speak very well to those 10 square blocks in downtown Southwest Portland that are really suffering the most. But that's different than normal, when we usually see the rural areas always lag. So this was an interesting business cycle, and part of it had to do with our migration trends, and that we started to see some actually, population firm up in some of our smallest counties, which hasn't happened in quite some time. Seeing growth, albeit small, in places like Klamath County and whatnot is something that was truly remarkable. While this was very much a U.S. phenomenon, people leaving the larger areas, it certainly has helped a lot of the state. So in terms of the labor market, things are still really healthy, and it's been a really inclusive expansion in terms of labor market expansion. So these graphs are kind of the flip of the unemployment rate. Well, unemployment rates are low, everybody knows that, but when you talk about unemployment rate, the first thing people ask me is always, is it because people are out of the labor force or into the labor force? It's their participation decisions, right? The unemployment rate can go up for good reasons, because there are a bunch of people wanting to enter the labor force and look for a job. For the same reason, it can go down for bad reasons when people get discouraged and they leave the labor force. So this is the employment to population ratio. So we're looking at these prime working age cohort, 25 to 54 years old, and just say, okay, how many of those people in Oregon have a job? What share of those people have a job? So it's a more simple concept, just the employment rate, not the unemployment rate. And so as you see here, it's for pretty much all of our cohorts, we're at or near the all-time high in terms of the share of Oregonians with a job. And that works across all sorts of different slices you can take. Now, we certainly still have disparities in Oregon across race and ethnicity and gender, and across rural, urban, and high-income, low-income households and the like. But for all of those different cohorts, we've seen this narrow over time to the point where it's about as close as it's ever been. And the remarkable thing about that was the pandemic recession. Because typically during recessions, we see these disparities widen significantly. This last one, they didn't widen. And now as we've continued into job gains, we've seen these tighten to the point where we have never really seen this kind of improvement, both in aggregate and as well as across different cohorts. So the one issue with this, of course, is it makes it real hard to find workers. If you're an employer and trying to hire, that's a challenge. Now, we know that this will cool off along with the business cycle. When the demand for labor cools, and we will see some slack in the labor market going forward. But unfortunately, even when this cycle cools off, it's going to be hard to find workers for the foreseeable future. And that's because of the demographics, because of the baby boom population cohort are entering into their retirement years. So at this point, we're looking at around 15,000 workers every single year dropping out of the labor market as they choose to retire. And these aren't just any workers. These are very highly productive workers with a lifetime of experience. And they're being replaced by younger workers who may be a little bit less productive until they build up that experience. Sorry. Yeah, did I say that out loud? Yeah. No, at any rate, so this is the issue. So now we're looking at, okay, So Oregon has traditionally, in every single expansion that the U.S. has had, we've outperformed the U.S., and a lot of it's been driven by job gains and population growth, which we've seen stalling as well, which I'll talk about. And so going forward, we can't really expect a lot of job gains to drive us because of this headwinds on the labor market right now. And so what do we need? Instead of jobs, we need productivity growth and relating income gains to try to do the heavy lifting. And so far, recently, that's been a really good story in Oregon, where here's output per worker, GDP per worker, but if we look at income and productivity, it's the same story, where Oregon has really outperformed the US now consistently for several years, which isn't something we're always necessarily used to during a period of expansion. Although we certainly always have above average job gains, maybe not so much income generation and productivity growth that we're seeing now, and we're seeing it across all the state. Most pronounced would be here in the Portland metropolitan area, in terms of, we're looking at somewhere to 4 to 9% in the Clackamas County there in terms of productivity gains from before the pandemic until the most recent data. So that's output per worker. And so that turns into larger than average income growth as we go forward. Now, some of the biggest productivity gains in percentage terms are the tiniest counties. But it takes a lot more to lift up Clackamas County than it does, somewhere out in Morrow County or the like. Morrow County is a bad example because they're the white one, and I can't really figure out what's going on there. But Crook County, I guess, would be a better example, or something like that that are a little bit smaller. But so we're seeing it widespread across the state, and it's really outperforming other states. Since pre-pandemic to today, we're looking at the third highest in the U.S., just behind Washington and Idaho in terms of these productivity gains. And these have turned into above average income growth. So the most encouraging thing is that it looks like these might have some legs that we're going to persist going forward, because what gets you productivity growth is when you invest, when you do R&D, when you spend money to modernize, and when you start new businesses. And that's one of the reasons for optimism going forward, is that these business openings and business births and the number of establishments in Oregon is still growing very, very rapidly. We've seen this boom in startup activity. And now we are starting to see some of them fail. New businesses do fail at relatively high rates, but nevertheless, there are still thousands more than we would have expected going into it. And of course, new businesses have the new productivity, new production technologies. They're leaner typically, and so we can see a lot of potential for growth here. Not all of them make it, but every time you get one surprise success, it's just like magic for economic development, right? We have someone selling shoes out of their van in Eugene. And next thing you know, in Portland, they have a world-class advertising firm, right? That's what, these homegrown are so much different, in terms of economic development, because they typically get all their, legal services and accounting services and all the ancillary stuff they spend locally. And so that really is really great for development purposes. The other thing we have is a tremendous amount of state and federal investment coming down the pipeline. Now, with the state stuff already hit last year. Anyone who drove around Oregon City last summer saw all the construction. It's that House Bill 2017 that's now really turning into actual spending. The same thing's going to happen on the federal side with the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and the like, and the Infrastructure Act. It takes a long time for those to turn into shovels in the dirt, but here over the next couple of years, we're going to really start to see that bear fruit. And so here on the right is the orange line is our public spending here in Oregon. It's already jumped up. A lot of that has to do with the state transportation package. And now we're going to continue to see it grow as that federal dollars roll in afterwards. Of course, the one federal thing that matters most to us would be the CHIPS Act, given our exposure to the semiconductor industry and tech firms. And it's not a huge job driver. I mean, although it will give us 3,000 or 4,000 more jobs on net, in terms of our expectations. In terms of the applications, there's something like 6,400 jobs that have been announced, but those don't always come to pass, and sometimes they're moving someone from one of their existing facilities to the new one, and so it's not really a net job gain. But the big thing is in the money, is in the income and the productivity, right? So with Oregon, we do a lot better than other states in terms of getting the real high-end office workers and particularly engineers. That we have these R&D facilities, a lot of this really bleeding edge stuff, where when you see these big announcements in Ohio and Arizona and stuff like that, that's more of the production workers. Now the production jobs are fine, they're good jobs. Here in Oregon, they're making $60,000 a year, which is just below the average worker in Oregon. But of course, the engineers are making $300,000 or $400,000 a year, and we have a lot of them. So in Oregon, we have about 1.2% of all the U.S. jobs. We have 8% of semiconductor jobs, and we have 17% of the engineers in semiconductor industry. And so that's you know, a really big engine, and not just for the West Side. In terms of these CHIPS Act announcements, we're seeing them across the state. Now, not all of them are the cutting edge stuff, but we have seen these announcements are spread across, or applications at least, are spread across the state, and we even get some here in Oregon City, surprisingly. Here we're just looking at the share across the whole metro region. Of course, the West Side is where the vast majority of them are, but nevertheless, we're getting 5 or 6% of them here in this Oregon City Puma, which is larger than the overall share of jobs. So there will be some. The Oregon City one, it's hard to read this because these are census areas. So it's that goofy one that looks kind of like Minnesota. So that the river is the bend there. So Oregon City would be right across from West Linn there where that bump is. So this area, unfortunately, we couldn't just isolate Oregon City. It has Milwaukee and some of Happy Valley in there too. But that's as small as they go in terms of the census areas. But there are quite a few here as well. And so with any luck, we could see some growth as a result of that investment too. So bottom line for the Oregon outlook is we're going with the consensus of this soft landing, just a slowdown in growth, but no real recession. But that said, these inflationary booms typically do not end well. And so it is it is still very possible that monetary policymakers can keep the rates too high for too long and choke off the economy, or we see inflation flare up again, in which case they have to hit the brakes harder, and we would go into some traditional downturn. And so right now, the most likely way that would look, we go ahead and try to give these alternatives to the policymakers so that they have something to work with, to think about, well, what if things go wrong? What's that going to look like? Right now, we would have a mild recession happening, in the next year, around 2025, something along those lines, where we might see some job losses. So the big story right now is really the demographics, and in particular, this stall we've seen in Oregon population growth that we haven't seen in years and years and years. So Oregon has traditionally, gained migrants from other states in good times and bad, particularly when jobs are available. But ever since the early 1980s, when the mills closed across all the state, and we saw people leaving from every region, in search of work, we haven't seen this. And so this is a little scary, but overall, it's good to remember that our demographics are really great compared to the typical state. And that's because of this young population cohort we have, this big millennial bounce here. So the millennials at 26% of our population today, that's very big relative to other states. That mountain there is large. Now it's, of course, not as large in our rural areas, but nevertheless, it's really the gold standard for economic development, these young households that are in their root-setting years. They're just about to they're starting to get in their peak earning years. They're buying houses, picking school districts, furnishing those houses, and the like. And so this is fantastic. The open question is whether the Gen Z cohort is going to move here just like the millennials did before them. Is Oregon just as attractive as it was back then in terms of drawing people? And so that's going to be really the question going forward, is whether this comparative advantage remains in the future. And one reason it's important is the home ownership. And you know, this is when households start to buy their houses. And so you look here at when you're 30 years old, we got about 20% of folks own their own home. But by the time you're at 40, we're up over 50% of folks own their home. And so even though this is seemingly delayed for the millennial population cohort, where a lot of them are having trouble getting in, and it's maybe delayed by a year or two, there's a whole lot of inertia here, just as people are getting into these peak years. And then, of course, it starts to drop when you're 80. I don't think that's downsizing to the city for the nightlife. I think that probably has a little bit more to do with assisted living and the like. But nevertheless, we have that, you know, so there is going to be quite a bit of demand for housing going forward. So that is particularly encouraging, especially if we can continue to draw in the young households as we have in the past. But for now, things have stalled. This is Oregon population growth. The blue and the orange are our two different measures, blue being the Portland State University, and the orange being the census estimates, which are a little weaker. But both of them have qualitatively they're the same. But we've seen this stalling out in population growth. Again, we haven't seen it for decades, but that time was completely different. It was because, you know, the mills were closing, the wood products industry was downsizing, and people left for jobs. Today, this is a completely different phenomenon, where almost anyone who wants a job can have one, but we're seeing folks move out anyway. And so this is a concern, and I'll talk about in a minute that we do have, you know, one of the prime suspects here is affordability. But as for the outlook, we have a very modest, you know, 0.5% or so, a little bit more growth in the outlook. That's very much slower than we've seen in the past expansions. And so there's some upside risk here. There's some downside risk too, and we presented it to policymakers in Salem, longer term outlooks where we say, well, what if we don't get our advantage back? What if, you know, the migration stalling out is kind of a long-term thing? And that turns out to be not quite as catastrophic as you'd think, at least in our 10-year forecast period. Part of it because we've already ratcheted this down to a really slow level. So 0 and 0.5% isn't as different as you'd think. And it also takes quite a while for these to really accrue, some of these losses. And so in our 10-year period, it's not as bad as if we were to look 20 years out, when we probably would see some really more significant impacts. But the migration is going to be as important as ever for Oregon. Again, our primary comparative advantage, largely because without it, we're not getting anything anymore in terms of the natural rate of population growth. If we look at the number of births minus the number of deaths, that's gone underwater in most of the state. I'm sorry, I didn't mention Clackamas County. Whoops, I got to go backwards. For the Portland State and the census numbers, pretty close in Clackamas County. They're only about 900 people off, but it's pretty much at 0 population gains for the county itself. But yes, in terms of our births and deaths, we saw a run up in deaths, of course, with the COVID pandemic. But the thing that's really sticky is that we're not seeing births increase. And in particular, since we have such a big millennial population cohort who are entering into their traditional childbearing years, we're not seeing it. In fact, we're pretty darn low. If you talk about fertility rate, which is the number of children that an average woman has over her lifetime, we're at 1.3. It takes 2.1 to replace the existing population. And so we're quite a bit below that. Now that said, of course, every high-income country in the world is below replacement level. But ours is particularly low. We're looking at bottom 5 across states in terms of the fertility rate. So the millennials here have yet to get busy. At some point they might. So the important thing is really the migration. And so we've finally seen this flip to where we are losing migrants to other states. But again, I think the real culprit here appears to be affordability, given that several things. One is a lot of the folks, one, as you see in terms of the blue line, the in-migrants haven't changed. We're still seeing a steady flow of people into Oregon. A lot of these people come from less affordable places, particularly California, as you know, and so that hasn't changed. And the fact that a lot of the folks that are moving out are going to less or more affordable places in rural Washington, Idaho, Texas, places like that, also suggest it might be affordability. The fact that a lot of the households that are moving out have children, and a lot of times more than one, also suggests that they need room and the like. And the fact that some of our rural areas in Oregon who are more affordable are doing better in terms of population trends than they've done in years, again, speaks to the fact that it's affordability. Now, we are seeing across the U.S. and here, some of that is starting to snap back a little bit, where we're starting to see some of these flows out from the big cities are starting to return, where now the big cities are growing or at least are flat, while some of the rural areas are starting to shrink. But nevertheless, we're starting to see some winding back here. The encouraging story here is the one population cohort that we continue to have positive net migration is this 18 to 24-year-olds. Like I said before, we need those Gen Zers to come and continue coming, and it looks like to date they still are. Working from home is part of it. Well, it's not such a big story, but the affordability is, yeah, like I said, the working from home, we're starting to see some return, to the office, not a terrible much. Here in this Oregon City Puma, we're looking at more than 1 in 5 workers is working from home right now, and so that's across the state. We have even before the pandemic, we had above average working from home. That increased, and we still are above average relative to most states. It's really a regional thing. Washington, Idaho, Oregon. I think you can point to quality of life as maybe one of the drivers. But affordability should be getting better. You see here, when we're looking at mortgage payment as a share of per capita income, we're looking at over 50% right now, on average. So that's something, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that this is going to let up, in particular if the outlook for interest rates plays out and we continue to see income growth. That should make affordability improve. On a smaller scale, the building activity, construction activity, we have seen some pickup in that. The multifamily is coming off, but we saw quite a bit of growth last year as they finished up those apartment complexes and now are moving to building more single-family homes, which we still need. We still have quite a shortage, even with slower population gains that have taken some of the heat off. And we've seen, as a result, some inventory accumulation. We're still not back to pre-pandemic levels, and the transactions have dropped. This is all very consistent with, with the interest rate environment that we're seeing today, and the lack of migration. But we still need to build more than we are today. So right now, at just under 20,000 housing starts a year, that's enough to keep up with our current inflows, but this historical gap that we have, which maxed out at 140,000 units if we count our houseless neighbors as well as folks looking to buy a home that can't get in. We still need quite a bit to do. It's encouraging the policy environment, and one piece of the policy environment that we've ended up catching in my office is the housing needs analysis. And so I'm out of time before questions, so I won't go too deeply into this, but just to say at the end of the year, we're going to put out this is another one of the things that policymakers didn't want to put in the housing agencies, but wanted us to go ahead and take a look at in terms of modeling the needs across the different regions of the state. And so I encourage you guys to pull this out. It was Eco Northwest did the original pilot study, which we're going to replicate going forward. And it really does look pretty good in Oregon City relative to other places. They have some of these heat maps in terms of how much of this, how much in terms of owner-occupied properties you have from the last decade, 2010 to 2020, and so at least pre-pandemic, Oregon City stands out like a sore thumb, big red dot, in terms of seeing a lot more of this, owner-occupied growth across the region. And so that's very encouraging. We'll see what goes forward and how much the slower population gains have taken some of the heat off of the market as we go forward. But you can look forward to that at the end of the year. But again, I encourage you to look at the work that's done in the past if you're interested in housing. So I ran over my time a little bit. I think it's about time to move to the questions.
Okay. Another question there. Let me go ahead and grab.
All right.
William. All right. So everybody know this question's from William. All right, what impacts in local economies do you see as a result of November's national elections?
Oh, Lord.
Thank you, William.
Well, in my little world, the biggest issue is federal tax policy or the expectations of federal tax policy. So I'm going to turn this into my little world in terms of the state finance insofar as when we see changes in administration or the potential for that, taxpayers react. And a lot of taxpayers have a lot of flexibility over when they can realize their income for tax purposes. And so, again, I'm talking about my own little world where I'm very sore about the $5.6 billion kicker. I'm sure you guys aren't as sore about it as I am. But the issue is when this uncertainty in tax policy creates these real distortions in terms of taxpayer behavior. So we saw in tax year 2021, we saw 25% growth in personal income tax liability, which was almost double anything we'd seen in any other year. In fact, the other years, which were in the 12, 13% range, stuff like that, those all could be associated with major tax reforms at the federal level, where either we had a tax cut that was expiring or a tax hike that they see in the future. And so taxpayers reacted by saying, I'm going to pull my income into the current period and push it out, or vice versa. So if it's an expiring Bush tax cut or if it's the Reagan tax cuts, we see these big waves. Well, obviously after this last election, taxpayers and the tax professionals and tax lawyers we talked to and accountants all told us, well, we were telling our clients to try to realize as much money as you can before some of these cuts are unwound, like the capital gains cuts and some of the corporate and the business taxes that go through the personal income tax forms and the like. And so we did see a tremendous wave that those tax cuts in the end never got unwound, but it certainly did impact our taxpayer behavior. So someone can earn money on a stock for 10 years and don't realize it for tax purposes until one day. And so we see these big bulges, and this creates some disruption for the public services. Now, in terms of the overall economy, I don't think it's going to matter too much because policymakers kind of have already used up all their ammo at the federal side, right? No matter who's elected, it's not like we can run much bigger deficits than we are today. And so I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference at the macro side of things.
Okay. Let's see if this microphone.
We can hand it back and forth if you like.
This one I think will come on here in a second. There we go. Okay, this is, thank you, Matthew. He's always available, does a great job. Now this one's going to be kind of a long question, so I want you to listen very carefully. I follow ITR, which is a apolitical, unbiased group, ITR Economics from the East Coast. They have been predicting higher inflation starting in 2025 through 2030, and a global recession coming in the 2030s due to a high public debt. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, right now it's hard to see a lot of inflationary pressure. That's because we are seeing labor markets cool off. Hopefully that will continue. And so it's not out of the question that we might see inflation reaccelerate. But without the kind of labor market tightness that we've seen in the past, that would be much less likely. And we don't have the same sort of things that drove the initial run-up in in inflation, which were twofold. We had the Ukraine war start, which isn't over, but it's not going to get worse in terms of the price of grain and the price of oil. And we saw those supply chain issues after the pandemic with this wave of demand where everybody wanted to buy stuff, goods, and and we're not seeing that anymore. And in fact, we're still seeing strong spending, but it's more evened out, right? In terms of the replacement cycle for a lot of these things. You don't need to buy a kayak every year. Everyone bought a kayak 2 years ago. They're not necessarily buying a kayak today. And so some of the supply pressure, the demand pressure and the supply chains is off. So not that it's out of the realm of possibility, additional inflation, but I wouldn't think in the near term. Now, longer term debt issues are a problem across the world. Now, the problem is the timing of that. If you say mid-2030s, that's really hard to do. From a forecasting perspective, I could say November 30th on 2032, that's when we're going to have the recession, but it's just going to make your forecast less accurate. So, that in terms of the debt overhang, who knows? The 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, it's hard to really, pick a date when we actually break the back of the economy with too much debt, when we crowd out too much of the private investment because the public sector is taking up too much of the debt and buying up too much of the debt, increasing interest rates and making it harder for private individuals and businesses to invest and spend.
Okay, and you mentioned, Mark, that spending is still strong, and I agree with that. The consequence, though, of a lot of that spending is people are using their credit cards to go ahead and acquire whatever it is they're interested in getting. Credit card debt right now is 25 to 30%, depending upon who you're with. That doesn't pencil out very well for a lot of people. Even with job growth and incomes going up, 25, 30%, and they're barely able to cover the minimum payment, which is just their interest cost. What do you suggest for people that are in that type of situation that want to move forward in today's economy?
Well, it's very challenging. It certainly is. Now, on an aggregate, if we look at the top line, we're still looking at healthy balance sheets overall because we had this huge buildup in these checkable deposits, banking accounts, credit, checking accounts, savings accounts, things like that during the pandemic, not just because of the federal aid, but because people were trapped in their homes and weren't spending as much as they normally would. And so there's still some of that cushion out there. And there's also cushion, as I showed earlier, in terms of home equity in Oregon, that if you do have a home, you've got a pretty big cushion. So if we look at this overall averages, things are still okay. But when you look below the surface, Kent's absolutely right that we're starting to see this credit card debt run up. We're actually starting to see delinquency rates finally start ticking up when people can't pay their bills. And a lot of this is, of course, concentrated around lower income households that have less spending ability or less home equity to tap or things like that. And so it's certainly an issue. I don't know in terms of the solution to it other than just tightening your belt, I guess, but that's very hard to do when you're living, paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, especially with inflation, even though it's slowing down, it already went up at such a tremendous amount, 18%, I think, is what they've said over the last few years. So, yeah, maybe it's down to 2, 3, 4%, but that's on top of the 18%. So the people that are having to go in to use their credit cards, that's just to cover a lot of their electric bills. Yep. PG, 40% increase?
That's still inflation, but you're right, Ken, absolutely. While inflation is slowing, prices are still high. It's not like we've gone into deflation where prices are going down. The prices are still very much elevated. It's just that the rate at which they're growing from here has slowed down. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Except for in the electricity and a couple other examples where we're still seeing, accelerating inflation. Also in some of the service sector, healthcare is accelerating as well.
So I noticed that you focused a lot about housing in your slides, which I think is very important. Our governor only introduced one bill in the short session this year, and it focused 100% on housing. And they were able to get approximately $375 million approved for infrastructure and incentives. But the price of housing went up so fast during the pandemic because so many people were staying home. And millennials are having a hard time saving for a down payment. Do you see millennials leaving this state to go to a more affordable state to live? So it seems like millennials are more transitory as to where they work. They're not starting with one company and retiring from that company anymore.
No, absolutely. And when you look at mobility for households, it's, those 20 and 30-year-olds are still the most mobile, always have been. But now they typically move for work, so that's encouraging. We have a strong job market, but affordability does seem to be weighing. Again, we're seeing a lot of folks move out who have young children. We're seeing people move to the lower cost areas all over the state and outside of the state. And so there's clearly something going on in terms of that. Hopefully, like I said, so far so good in terms of the 18, 24-year-olds are still moving here on net. So that's encouraging. But, affordability is going to be an issue for some time. Again, it should get better with the interest rates coming down in the near term, but we're still underbuilt. And we do need more supply here in Oregon. The governor's policies and the legislature's policies in the last two sessions have gone away, have pushed it in the right direction, but it's the public sector can't do it by itself. The numbers are just too big. And so it is encouraging, that they do have task forces and trying to do all we can about zoning laws or trying to put in infrastructure, subsidies or, and the like, and some, backing loans and things like that. And they're really trying to take a kitchen sink approach, which I think is probably necessary in terms of getting the numbers we need. But that is the one silver lining to our population slowdown is that some of that heat has come off relative to where it was a couple years ago, where it looked like there was no way we could, hit the targets. When the governor was saying something like, we'll look at the building, whoops, went by it. So here we're looking at 20,000 units a year. Her goal was 35,000, which is possible. We did it at the peak of the housing boom for a year or so, but we were supposed to do 35,000 a year, which was a heavy lift. Now we're not at 35,000 a year anymore, which is nice. And as we do this housing needs analysis over the next year, we'll have a better idea of what that is. We still have a historical gap, but it's becoming more and more feasible that we'll make it up. We can make it up in the near term.
Having been in housing for the last 40 years, I appreciate everything you're saying about catching up. But I also understand Oregon's land use system is not about catching up. We have a very restrictive and antiquated land use system in this state. And I'm just concerned that now that these millennials are hitting that point when they want to form their households, getting a project through the pipeline could take 5 to 10 years in today's environment. And I just hope that the legislature recognizes that and helps develop and implement programs that will actually allow us to accomplish what the governor's hoping to do.
Yeah, and if we drag our feet too long, we won't have to worry about it anymore because of the baby boomers leaving their homes. Here, pretty soon we're going to have some pretty organic increases in housing supply.
Just a quick question on baby boomers, because they have the largest amount of equity in their homes because they've owned them for a long time and in some cases haven't paid off. But when they are living on a limited amount of income, let's just say Social Security and a pension, but then they have these high utility bills, high food bills, so they go, I'll take out a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, but their interest rate's 12% and they don't have an income. But they got to make that payment every month. how do they, I mean, that seems to be a painful issue for seniors.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and it's sensitive too. Although, you know, you can think of, you know, grandma on the beach in Connecticut can't pay her property taxes, but she has, you know, millions of dollars worth of equity. You know, you can't just say, oh, well, as long as you don't spend that on an RV, you'll be okay. You know, you don't want to hear that, right? And you're right, the rates are a big burden. And so, and not every senior has $2 million in equity or whatever to actually tap in order to go through that. So that can be a tremendous burden. Like I said, property taxes as well, in terms of just the borrowing costs and that as well. And so a lot of seniors do go underwater, and it's difficult and are pushed out of their homes before they're ready to be.
Well, maybe the legislature will come up with something where they don't have to pay that in a monthly payment, but it can just be accrued. Okay, we're going to move on to millennials again. Do you think, and Mark, you're going to have to help me on this last line, do you think part of our outmigration of baby boomers has anything to do with our 1 million low threshold?
Yeah, 1 million estate tax.
Oh, estate tax.
Yeah, now our advisors, the tax lawyers and accountants we talk to, seem to think that the estate tax is not as big of a deal as capital gain tax. That's what they're worried about. Is someone who's had their business for their whole lifetime go to sell out. It makes a whole lot of sense to move across the border before you do that. In terms of the estate tax, from what I understand, there are a lot of you can manage around it with family trusts and things like that to take a lot of the burden away. But that said, it's in terms of the raw numbers of estate tax, we've been setting records every year for the last couple of three, and it's really hard to say because you'll have 1 month with just a tremendous amount of revenue, and then it drops off. It's very volatile from month to month, but we're seeing near record months on a regular basis now in terms of estate taxes. And so it's either a lot of people who are doing it, or the other suggestion that some of our advisors tell us is that people are really laser focused on that federal estate tax, which has a higher threshold. They're really ignoring Oregon for the most part. And so we are seeing a lot. Now, the encouraging thing is that the folks that are paying the most of the estate tax right now probably are savvy enough to manage around it if they wanted to, because it's really tilted towards the super big estates. Most of our revenue is coming from the really high-end households. And the folks that are around the $1 million barrier don't add up to much in terms of the aggregate. We're having, just some really big taxpayers that are passing away, and a lot of those could have, thought about managing around it unless they, die unexpectedly.
Okay.
I feel like a vulture, looking at the obituaries and stuff to try to track this.
We all look at the obituaries. Yeah. All right. In one of your earlier slides, you were kind of showing the percentage of individuals that are employed, but you topped it off, I believe, at age 54. But most people nowadays work past 54. So if you really looked at the total workforce that is engaged in some type of occupation, what do you think our actual percentage of the workforce that would be? The percentage of the population would be actively engaged in the workforce?
Yeah, it's declining. Now, it's hard to say if you had children as well and things like that. That's why we look at the prime working age. But, we're under 2/3 now if you look at children as well, and it's declining, largely because of this large retiring baby boomer population cohort. So we look at these prime working age individuals just to try to abstract away from this longer term trend where we've seen all these retirements, and so it looks like there are fewer workers out there. To the extent that there's people sitting on the sidelines who want a job that don't have them, that's why we kind of isolate this. But you're right, we could push past the 54 nowadays, much later than that probably for the prime working age cohort, as people have been a little bit pushing off their retirement. We have seen a little bit of this, in the numbers in terms of pushing off retirement. Some of it, a lot of it has to do with the wages that we've seen in recent years and stuff during the pandemic where, they were talking about it as this great retirement, right? That it was one of the things, a great resignation, right? In the pandemic that we were going to see all sorts of people just say, I give up. I've been a school teacher my whole life. I don't need to deal with this Zoom. I'm gonna drop out. But actually, during the 2 years of the pandemic, we actually saw a little cool down in the number of retirements. Now, obviously, still large because of this age cohort that's moving through. But given that the labor market was so tight and wages were so high, and some of these employers are begging their experienced workers to stay on in some capacity, we actually saw a slowdown in retirements. But like I say, for the foreseeable future, it's still going to be a big burden on the labor force until the bulge works its way through the snake.
Do you think a reason why we might have had a slowdown in retirements is there's so many occupations now that can be work from home and remote?
Yeah, I'm
instead
sure
of
that
having to go into an office?
I'm sure that had something to do with it. Absolutely. And yeah, you may have intended to retire, but then your employer calls you up and says, hey, do you want to take on a couple contracts or to take on a couple hours a week? And I'm sure a lot of people thought that was better than having to commute in.
Mm-hmm. This question has to do with millennials. I was going to ask it earlier, but typically over the last decade or so, the millennials were attracted to the urban core. They were renting. They wanted to be where the single nightlife and the action was. And now that they're getting to a certain point in their life, they have other priorities, such as household formation. Do you see the millennials trending to go to the suburbs and the rural areas because of that change in their lifestyle?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to isolate the age cohorts, but we are seeing, this move outward. And this is, like you say, it's part of the life cycle, right? Once you start having children, now you're interested in, maybe having a yard or the school district or crime or whatnot, and less interested in the nightlife and 4-star or 5-star restaurants and the like. You're too busy with the kids to go to a 5-star restaurant. And so, yes, that's typically been the pattern. Again, we've seen a slowdown in terms of this home ownership, or rather a delay relative to previous generations. So I expect this dynamic to continue going forward. But certainly at the aggregate level, taking out the age cohorts, we've seen much stronger growth in the suburbs than we have in the urban core. That's not just in Oregon, that's across the U.S.
And a follow-up that's on the card. What are some ways a place like Oregon City can attract millennials?
Well, it sounds like they're doing a darn good job of it right now. The affordability is great. And like I say, when we look at those building maps and the owner-occupied homes, that growth over the last 10 years has been no accident, because you have a quality of life and more affordability relative to a lot of the places, particularly the urban core. And so we've seen the tremendous amount of development out here in the whole area, Milwaukee and Oregon City and even and Happy Valley and all the ones in the Puma area and whatnot. We've seen a tremendous amount of growth. And I think just continuing that supply to try to keep Oregon City relatively affordable. It's not that affordable. I don't know if I added that slide. It's everywhere's expensive now, but relative to some others, did I? I may not have. Oh, here. Yeah, so in Oregon City, we're now at the point where where the household income needed is now, above where you would be in Salem, in Eugene, but not nearly where you are in the urban core yet. And so affordability has been eroding everywhere, here as well, but still, relative to anywhere closer into Portland, this is about as good as it gets.
Okay, we're going to jump into another arena here because we have Tim Cook, the president of Clackamas Community College, in attendance, and this will kind of be focused on curriculum and programs and training. You mentioned in one of your slides that even though Washington County has by far the predominant stronghold on chips manufacturing, semiconductor development, engineers getting paid very well, but even Oregon City was on the map. If you were Tim Cook, the president of Clackamas Community College, helping you develop a curriculum, what would you recommend that look like as we prepare for an economy utilizing artificial intelligence?
Oh, goodness, I did have an AI slide. So that's obviously there's a lot there. But right now, you know, if you look at what little literature is out there, it does look like on net this is going to be a productivity enhancement. It might actually help with employment, right? It's something that, you know, can make an individual office worker much more productive, that speed up a lot of their time and therefore they're more valuable. Now, that said, you know, technology can reduce jobs, particularly those that aren't face-to-face or in-person jobs, and we've seen it in the past, but a lot of times it's kind of overstated that we're going to be replaced by robots or artificial intelligence or things like that, right? Because, you know, we always say, oh, well, geez, you know, you look at a timber mill nowadays and there are like 8 people in there, you know, and used to be, you know, full of people. And you say, well, geez, you know, and then the outsourcing, you know, to other lower cost countries, you know, geez, that's got to be killing a lot of jobs, right? But then if it were, then we would see these big increases in measured productivity in terms of how much output per each worker. You know, how much is generated per every worker out there, and we haven't over the last few decades. You know, so even with all this technological improvement, it's not like the labor demands are that much smaller. You know, and so the hope would be that there's some good that comes with it as well as the bad. Obviously, there's going to be churns, there are going to be winners and losers across different industries. Some industries are going to take a hit, some industries are going to be improved, but hopefully on net, it should increase people's earning capacity and their productivity going forward. And so hopefully, like I say, winners and losers aside, there will be some bad examples where, you know, we lose industries because of it. But nevertheless, productivity growth is, you know, often a good thing, right? You know, there's always winners and losers to productivity. Right, the ATM came around and we don't have bank tellers anymore, you know, but that wasn't necessarily a terrible thing.
So recognizing that AI is here to stay, it's just going to become much more part of daily life in so many different ways. If you were just graduating from high school, say, and you were choosing a major to take going forward, whether it's at a community college or a four-year university, what industries do you see benefiting the most and growing the most by the utilization of AI?
Oh, I'm not exactly sure. I think obviously a lot of the office jobs I think will be improved, you know, in terms of productivity enhancements. The only advice I would really give to someone going into school right now is, for heaven's sake, don't take economics.
And why is that?
I'm just old and jaded, that's all.
Well, we got his PowerPoint slides this morning to give you an idea how current you want to be with all your information. Economics is something that changes every single day.
No, it is exciting to keep track of, but humbling as well. You know, wrong more than I'm right.
Well, hopefully wrong for the right reasons.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to change topics again here. Tourism's a big industry in the state of Oregon. Has been, hopefully will continue to be. We're blessed with some amazing natural features, whether it's the oceans, the rivers, the mountains, the streams, the trees. But what impact do you think the homeless condition in the metro region has had on the tourism industry and our economy?
Yeah, so in terms of overall tourism, I wouldn't say that much. If you look at lodging taxes and the like across the state, you know, a lot of the regions of the state, the coast, Central Oregon, Hood River, these places are booming. And it's been, you know, much stronger than even before we've started to see this increase in homelessness. We've seen a tremendous growth anyway. Where we're really getting hit, though, is business travel. You talked about, vacancy rates in the office buildings. Well, there are also, vacancy rates in our business hotels. And we, of course, we built a big one just before the pandemic in downtown Portland. And so this business travel has yet to bounce back much at all. It used to be people would fly, all their teams in from Asia or whatever, and we'd have all these big conferences and business travel and the like. And that was not only, this direct impact on Portland and the downtown area in terms of the demand of and the spending of all these folks coming into town, but they always come, in July and August, and they'd see how wonderful it is here when it's not raining, and then they'd say, I'd like to come back, I'd like to move to Portland, and I think we're getting a lot less of that. It's certainly no fun anymore to walk around, your hotel in the center city right now, or at least less fun than it was, even by some of the fanciest restaurants and whatnot in town. It's just not as attractive. And so I think over the long term that'll be a hit. And also, just given that I don't think that the business travel is ever going to bounce back to where it was before, is also going to be a weight on that form of tourism. But in terms of our natural areas, they sell themselves. The only issue being trying to get the workers to staff it.
So as we continue to see this transition and transformation from the metro being where so much business activity took place, where now there's so much hybrid and remote work, and I think as I was talking with you earlier, Portland, I believe now has the highest vacancy rate of the metro region in the nation at a little over 30% office vacancy. There's ripple effects that are associated with that. Other businesses that need that foot traffic no longer have what they need not only to thrive but to survive. Do you see that trend reversing in the next 10 years, or do you continue to see the exodus of businesses from the metro region to the suburbs?
It's starting to at least slow down, so getting a little better already in terms of that exodus. But you're right, when we had the army of commuters would come in downtown every day, and they'd buy coffee and lunch and anniversary present, maybe get some gasoline and then drive back. That was a tremendous amount of spending, and it really dwarfs anything you see in terms of the tourism side or whatnot. Was just this direct commuter demand in terms of the downtown area in particular. Now, the one silver lining to having such high vacancy rates and whatnot is that, as economists, we talk about the invisible hand, and it's putting a tremendous amount of pressure on prices. And as prices get lower and lower, typically that it's going to attract more and more people. It'll be, if you're trying to decide between Cruz Way and a downtown office building, when that price differential becomes large enough, that is an incentive to reestablish downtown, and hopefully we can get some positive return from this very negative situation with all the openings and vacancies.
And with the prices obviously going down in the metro core, do you see it financially feasible for those buildings to be transformed for a different use?
Unfortunately, our developer friends say no. It's one of the things that's in the kitchen sink proposals, and is there for most cities and urban cores, that you say, okay, can't we just turn this into residential if we need residential stuff instead of office and big box retail and stuff that is in this secular decline. But unfortunately, I guess it's just doesn't pencil out because it's just too costly to renovate these buildings, to make them up to fire code, to get plumbing in all the units, make them seismically safe. And it's just, I guess, for the most part, it's very rare that you can find a building that you can really make pencil out to turn it into residential, although we need it.
And I always like to ask our speakers these last couple of questions. What do you see, Mark, as the biggest opportunity as an economist for our state, and what do you see as the biggest challenge for our state?
Well, I think you've hit on the challenges in terms of the crime and the homelessness and the housing. I think we've really hammered on the challenges. The opportunity is that we're still Oregon, and in terms of both the quality of life in general, And we're still, it's still a very scenic place with a lot of options in terms of, the mountains and the coast and different recreational options, which is always going to be great. We still have a relatively low cost, even with this increase in electricity costs. We're still, we still are a relatively low cost place on average. For the, that's just average, obviously not everywhere. And so the thought is, we do still seem to be attracting these young folks. Like I say, the gold standard for economic development. And I think that's really what we have going forward. And that hasn't not really gone away, right? So we have this huge tech industry here, but we don't have any universities that, no slight to, Oregon State or whatnot, but we don't have MIT or Stanford here. But if we want to engineer from there, we can get them to move here at a discount relative to other places. And that's always been our, primary comparative advantage, that these, skilled workers that are heading into their prime will, do kind of select Oregon. And that, that's, that migration isn't just about, creating demand for retail sales and pizza parlors and housing. It's more about creating a skilled, relatively low-cost workforce for our firms. And so that's really where we, could possibly see some upside risk. If we get back to our traditional patterns, I think that, Oregon will continue to boom. But there are risks going ahead. And one, in terms of migration, we have upside. Part of it is, the climate. And we do have relatively abundant supplies of water compared to other places, and less heat. Of course, there are downsides to that too. If you spend, 2 months a year in fire smoke, in wildfire smoke, that's a minus. But I think, again, it would be these traditional migration trends coming back would be the biggest upside here in Oregon, with the biggest downside being what we're seeing in terms of quality of life erode and affordability.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mark. What a great presentation today. Long, in-depth responses to all the questions. Thank you, each of you, for providing us the questions. But I think we're going to wrap it up unless somebody else has a question at all. Oh, over here.
It's the same presentation you gave to the house.
I have to ask Senator Meek. There's some overlap.
Some overlap, but a lot of the presentation they gave us was the current revenue forecast, what we're expecting for this upcoming biennium, whether we'll have a kicker or not. So those details.
And did they understand it?
They did. Yeah, it's a great
They
presentation.
accepted it?
Yeah, we accepted their.
And are you prepared to act on it?
Well, we won't act on it. We already did. We acted on it in February because that's our last chance to adjust our budget.
So I apologize for the long rambling answers. I will not give a long rambling answer about the kicker. It's not my favorite topic. So we'll leave it
All
at
right.
that.
Thank you, Mark. All right, great slides. Really enjoyed your slides. A lot of good information there. Okay, so again, the gray cards on your tables, if you'd like to leave us some notes about today's presentation or provide us your recommendations for future forum topics. As I mentioned at the beginning, next month's a different venue. It's called Business of the County. We'll have all 5 county commissioners here. It'll be more of a question and answer program format rather than presentations by them. That'll be saved for their State of the County event on May 9th. But ours is April 18th. Again, it's not the 4th Tuesday. It's on, I think it's the 3rd Thursday from 11:30 to 1:30. We have sent out the registration flyer already, so check your inboxes. Get registered early because we're hoping to have a really good turnout for that being the first time that event's been held. And we're honored here to be able to host it as the Oregon City Business Alliance at the Abernathy Center. So with that being said, it's not raining, so time to go out and get in your cars before hail shows up. Thank you all for coming. See you next month.